Hey, Jaywalkers. I'm calling this message, What Are You Setting Up Beside God? And we're going to look at Mark chapter 13. Yes, we're moving into Mark chapter 13 in this new year. And it says in verses 1 through 2, as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. And Jesus said to him, Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone standing upon another that will not be thrown down. So, those are the only two verses we're going to read today because there's a lot in there. Historically, there's a lot in there, and we're going to revisit something in the Old Testament, but that's it. They walk out of the temple. The disciples look to Jesus and they say, Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it gorgeous? Like, look at these stones. Look at this building, all this stuff around us. It's so pretty. It's so nice. And Jesus says, It's going to be torn down. So what's going on there? This is sort of discouraging maybe to you, but I want to talk through what's going on. So wonderful stones and wonderful buildings. We hear about the temple and maybe we think about like a church building or a cathedral or something like that. But this place was beautiful. Solomon built a temple and it was a sight to see. And then it got destroyed when Babylon came and invaded. And they rebuilt it. Ezra was one of the main guys involved in that. There was a priest who was helping. He was the priest, and there were some other people that were helping him also. Scribes and priests and people came up. Nehemiah was involved in that story. So there was a lot going on whenever that was being rebuilt. But it said that the people who saw the first temple looked at this one and were like, oh, it's nothing like the first one. They were like disappointed in how this new temple looked. And so this is the same temple that we're talking about here that's been there for like 1,000 years now. So it's a big part of the community. And Herod, when he comes around, he's got money, he's got resources, he's got a plan. He's gonna make the temple great again, right? He's gonna spend a long time getting this thing back up to beautiful and glorious. And so that's what he starts doing. He starts at around 19 BC. And by the time it's in Jesus' day, there's been construction going on for about 50 years. So they're still working on it, but man, has it come a long way. It's about 500 yards by 400 yards now. It's a huge area, the temple and the courts, which is 5 football fields long, 4 football fields wide. It's got these stones. The stones are giant. They're 50 feet wide, 25 feet tall. One stone, 15 feet deep. So we're talking massive stones. A crane today wouldn't have even been able to move one of these stones. That remodeling that started for him started in 19 BC and it ended in 63 AD. So it was 80 something years that they were working on this beautiful remodeling of the temple. It was plated with gold, so there's gold on top of it. If you were walking by at sunrise or sunset, it was said that the gold would blind your eyes. You wouldn't even be able to look directly at the temple. And the places that weren't gold, it was made out of marble, and the marble was so beautiful and so pure white that if you were coming from a distance, it would have looked to you like the temple was covered in snow in the areas that the marble was showing. It was a beautiful picture, a beautiful scene. People came from miles and miles to worship there. It was the best of the best. Beautiful. People used to swear on the temple. We know that because the Bible actually records that. Jesus tells them, you swear on the temple, but if you swear on the money in the temple, then that's not a good thing. So this was like, it had become, for some of the people of Jerusalem, for some of the Jewish people who would travel there, it had become the main attraction. It was taking the place of God. It had become an idol. And that is my definition of an idol. You'll find a lot of different definitions in the Bible. When it talked about it in the Old Testament, it was often referring to an actual like carved image or something. But to me, in the way that it's kind of outlined from Jesus's day on, and especially into our day today. It's not like many people are walking around with little carved images calling them gods in Christianity or other major religions of the world. There are still some that do have carved images like that. But my definition is an idol is simply something that people worship that isn't God. It's something that we set up beside God. Idols can never stand against God. So we're going to go to a little throwback story in the book of 1 Samuel. It's a pretty cool story. So we know that the Israelites built a wilderness tabernacle that is going to resemble this temple that they're going to build later, but they hadn't built it yet at this point in time. And so the Philistines were the people at that time that the Israelites were fighting against. And there was a story in 1 Samuel chapter 4 where the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant and they take it back to their city and they set up, it says in 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1, we'll start in verse 1. When the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. So from where they got it to their city. Then the Philistines took the Ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. So that's where the title of the message comes from. What are you setting up beside God? Because this is what these people did. They found something. They're like, hey, this is pretty cool. I like this. I'm going to set it up next to all the things that I'm currently worshiping. And they were worshiping Dagon at the time. And so they set up the ark right next to it. Like, this is my room of holy things. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So that's wild. Their God, they walk in, and it's face down in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And then it says, so they took Dagon and put him back in his place. So they're like, what's going on here? How'd this thing end up like this? What's it doing on the ground? Picked it back up, stood it back up where it was. And then it says, but when they rose early on the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, same as before, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. That's pretty wild. Nobody else was there, just the Ark of the Covenant and this statue that they made, that they set up next to the presence of God in the Ark of the Covenant. And God took care of business. This thing ended up face down, head chopped off, hands chopped off. God took care of it himself. He will not allow something to stand with him. Idols cannot stand next to God. So my question to you is, what are you setting up beside God? Doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. The temple's not a bad thing. Looking at its rocks and how it's brought the people of Israel and their culture together, that's not a bad thing. But if we're putting it in the place of God, if that's the main attraction instead of God, then it's an idol. And the same is true for family. We can love our family, but if it's taking the place of God, we can love our kids, but if they're taking the place of God, we can love our career, and it can be a great thing, but if it becomes our main focus, or if money becomes our goal, or if fame and popularity become our driving force, or if we just like things that are beautiful and things that are entertaining and things that are fun, we might be setting them up next to God. We might be bringing all of these things in our life together and worshiping all of them. I find myself looking on my phone a lot to see what my team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, are doing. They're trying to make the playoffs this week, and stuff needs to happen for that to occur, and they just won their game. So now if things happen a certain way, I worshiped football, basketball. I worshiped my own education. I've worshiped things that are not God. I've set them up beside God. And those things end up falling. Those things end up with their head chopped off and their hands chopped off on the ground, figuratively or literally. And Jesus knows that this is going to happen. This is what he talks about next in the story. These disciples come to him and they say, look how beautiful this is. And he's like, it's temporary. It's not the point. It's not the focus. The focus was never meant to be on the temple, the rocks, the building, how big it is, how beautiful it is. I got something in my eye. It was meant to be on God in the temple. It was meant to be on worshiping and praising him, the creator, not the created, not the thing that we made to worship him at. It's supposed to be the place that we worship him. And that's not what's happening. So Jesus saw its destruction. We never would have imagined this, but Jesus saw it. And it came to pass. Just 7 years after the completion of the temple in 63 AD and around 70 AD, there was a Jewish revolution that started against the Romans in Palestine, and the Jewish people were winning early on. They were making some noise. They were gaining little victories. They were scoring touchdowns or up big in the game, and but it did not end that way. The way it ended was complete destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, including the temple. So I'm going to tell you the story. It's how the story goes when you look back in history, the one that's been passed down. Not 100% sure how accurate it is. This is not from the Bible because this is after the biblical record had been sealed and completed, after the book of Revelation time had been written and all of those things, or right around that same time actually, because that's what's coming up. So the story goes that the Jewish people fled to the temple. Why would they have fled there? Because it was the strongest structure in the city. It was then surrounded by the Roman soldiers, and one of them, who is rumored to have been drunk at the time, started a fire, and that fire burned down the temple. The fire got so hot that it actually melted that gold that was on top of the temple, the one that shined in the sunlight, and that gold melted down into the gaps between the rocks, these big giant rocks that were stacked on top of each other, making the walls of the temple. So the story goes that because they melted the rocks, or the gold in between the rocks, that the soldiers and the Caesar at the time wanted to recover that gold. So he ordered that all of the rocks be dismantled, taken down, moved, and the gold be retrieved from in between them. And that's the story of how the temple got destroyed completely, even the rocks. And that's why people today don't know the exact temple location. They know some of the outer walls, but where the actual temple was built with those giant stones, it's been lost to this destruction. And Josephus, who is a now famous Jewish historian, he wrote that the Romans never intended to destroy the temple, but that they were driven to it by the fierceness of the Jewish opposition and by accident, which seems to support that story. That was written in War of the Jews 6.4 by Josephus, an actual historical document written by a Jewish person, non-Christian, but written by a Jewish person. So that's the story. That's what actually happened. And Jesus prophesied and predicted that. And he said there's not going to be a stone left here upon another that will not be thrown down. And that's exactly what happened. So what can we take from this? Well, what I take from it is I need to be careful about the things that I stand next to God, that I set up next to God, because the temple fell because it was stood up next to God. And nothing stands against the God of the universe and remains standing. It bows down to him. It will be destroyed because he's too great and too powerful and too strong and too mighty. the answer, what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 5, because I read part of that story. The rest of that story was that the Philistines ended up being like, man, this thing just destroyed our God, and now people are getting sick, people are getting tumors, like bad stuff's happening. We're sending this thing to a different city. So they sent it to a different city, and bad stuff started happening there. People started arguing against each other, rumors, like they started fighting each other, like they started breaking out, getting sick, plagues, like all kinds of bad things happening. They did that to 2 or 3 cities, and then they said, we got to send this thing back to Jerusalem, back to Israel. We got to send it back because Jerusalem's not really there yet, but to Israel. And so they decided that they're going to send this back, the Ark of the Covenant. So they didn't have to go take it back. They didn't have to go fight to retrieve it back. They didn't have to go defend God's honor. God took care of himself and fought for himself and destroyed all of his enemies, just like he can and always has. And his presence came back to his people. So that's what happened. When it returned, it blessed them until the ark too became an idol. So this thing that was holding the presence of God, God's presence was the actual treasure, yet they started to flaunt around this Ark of the Covenant and how beautiful it was and how it was made of gold, and they used to lead battles carrying it with them, leading the battle and all these things. And it's like they missed it again. It's the presence of God. It's him being there in spirit and being with them that actually is the beauty and the gift. They made the ark the idol, just like the Israelites or the Jewish people in Jesus's day and after would make the temple an idol. We make all these things an idol. We tend to mistake the thing containing the presence of God for God. We look at the thing that we can see. We look at the thing that we can touch. And I think that's part of why God was like, you know what? I'm going to come down to the earth. I'm going to come down and I'm going to be someone that you can see and someone that you can touch. I'm going to return to you. And it's not because you deserve it or because you've earned it or because you fought for it. I'm doing that because I want to do that, because I can take care of myself. And this is what I want to do. I want to have a relationship with you. I want to bless you. I want to be with you. I want to show you who I am. And so God came down to the earth. And yet, even though he came down to the earth, people sought his miracles. They sought what he could give them. They missed his presence to the point that they destroyed the temple of God. They destroyed Jesus. They hung him on a cross and he died. And that should have been the end of the story. But like so many other times, Jesus went and he handled and took care of sin, and he took care of death. And he laid those things that were holding us in bondage at his feet. He cut off the head of death. He chopped off the hands that were gripping us in slavery and in service to the rulers and powers and principalities of this world. Jesus destroyed that, just like God destroyed Dagon in that temple. Nothing stands against the God of the universe, and that is Jesus Christ. So he came back, and now his presence is available to us. Comes back to his people, just like he's always wanted to. Will we accept his presence? That's the question. That's what is at stake here. What are you setting up besides God? The answer is you should be setting up nothing beside God. God should be the number one, the only in your life. Now, those other things that he gives you are blessings, but they're not him. And if we start to worship and we start to idolize those things, then those things cannot stand against him, because he's too strong and too powerful, and nothing can stand against him. So when those things go wrong in our lives, and when we start to lean on our own understanding, and when we start to try to praise and worship things and created things more than the creator, then we will have issues and things will fall apart. And this is what Jesus is saying, and he's about to go into some prophecies about the signs of the end of the age, which we'll talk about next week. But this is the issue. We can't set up things next to God. We should set up nothing beside him. He's the number one, the only, and everything else is a blessing from him that we should recognize as such. So if you've never done that, if you've never put God in his rightful place, we're going to do so right now. Say, God, I see you. I see you as Jesus Christ when you came to this earth. And I know that there are some things that I've set up beside you, and I'm sorry about that. I've set up myself, I've set up good things sometimes and not so good things sometimes, and I'm sorry for setting up anything there because I know it doesn't deserve to stand next to you. God, please forgive me for that. I know that you're the one and only Savior, that you're the Lord, and I make you Lord of my life today. I believe that Jesus died on the cross to set me free from the bondage that's holding me back, from the sin that is deserving of death. But I accept that gift today and I make him my Lord and Savior, the gift of salvation, of freeness, of newness of life. And I will turn from it and walk in step with you and your Spirit for the rest of my days. God, I give you all the glory, and I ask that you would be with me in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, if you prayed that prayer, welcome to the family of believers. It's not the words that save you, it's a change of heart, a change of spirit, and God is going to come into your heart and do something new. And I believe that because that's what he's always wanted, is to be with you and to have his presence with his people. So that's what he just did. And we celebrate that today. We also are starting the fast today, the Daniel fast, 10 days or 21 days of giving up certain foods and drinks, caffeines, sugars, meats. And I'm not telling you exactly how to do it. You can look up the Daniel fast and see how to do it. But I am inviting you to join however God leads you to. And I know that if there's something that you're setting up besides God, maybe it's food, maybe it's meat, maybe it's coffee, maybe it's sugar, ice cream. I don't know what it is, but let God talk to you about it. Ask him for a word for 2024. Ask him to move and work in your heart. Give him your time. Give him the first and best of your time. And decide that you're going to study his word every day of this year. And then commit to it. It's not a resolution. It is a commitment that God is worthy of, because nothing goes before him and nothing goes beside him. So I want to invite you again. We started our discipleship nights, our Zoom calls on Tuesdays, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you're invited to join us this week. It's week 2 this week, and I'd love to see you there. The Zoom call information can be found on Jaywalkers Global, probably on the website, jwlkrs.com as well. Or you can just go to Zoom and enter the number 739-6681-5494 at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday. And we'll be there. And I look forward to seeing you guys. I love you. Have a great week. Don't set up anything besides God. It doesn't end well. And I'll talk to you real soon. Love you guys.